The church bell rang at midnight, and the pastor locked the doors before anyone could ask why. Only 5 of us were inside. Then he lifted a loose wooden panel beneath the altar and opened a forgotten vault. Inside was one dusty box with my full name carved into the lid. I had never seen it before, but my hands started shaking. My father had died 12 years earlier, and suddenly I felt like he was standing beside me. If you like stories where family secrets refuse to stay buried, subscribe to Family Betrayal and stay with me. The photos, faces, and background scenes in this video are visual recreations for storytelling and imagination only. The pastor pushed the box toward me. "Your father left this for you," he whispered. I opened it and found an old photograph of my parents beside a woman I didn't recognize. On the back, Dad had written, "Find her before you trust anyone in this family." My heart dropped. I looked at the other 4 people, wondering which one had already lied to me. Then my uncle stood up and said, "Close that box." His voice wasn't angry. It was frightened. That scared me more than anything inside the box. I asked him what he knew, but he wouldn't answer. The pastor reached into the vault again and pulled out a sealed envelope. My mother's handwriting was on it. She had been dead for 3 years. I stared at my name on the envelope and realized this wasn't just a message from my father. It was a warning from both of them. I tore open my mother's envelope with trembling fingers. The first line said, "If you are reading this, someone in our family has already lied to you." I felt a cold knot in my stomach. My uncle stared at the floor, refusing to meet my eyes. The pastor quietly told him to sit down. I asked who the woman in the photograph was. Before anyone answered, the church doors opened. An older woman stepped inside, leaning on a cane. I recognized her eyes immediately. She was the woman from the photograph. She looked at me for several seconds and whispered, "Your father promised you would find me one day." I couldn't speak. She told me her name was Claire and that she was my father's older sister. My whole life, I had been told Dad was an only child. Claire said that was the first lie. The second was worse. She claimed my uncle had forced her out of the family after she discovered money missing from my grandparents' business. My father had tried to expose him, but everyone chose silence. I wanted to believe her, yet part of me resisted. How could my parents hide an aunt from me for decades? Claire handed me a small brass key. "This opens something your father never wanted your uncle to find." My uncle suddenly stood and shouted, "You don't know what you're doing." I had never seen him that scared. I looked at Claire, then at the key in my palm. For years, I had blamed my father for leaving so many questions behind. Now I wondered if he had been trying to protect me. I decided to find out what the key opened, even if the truth destroyed the family I thought I knew. The key opened a metal box hidden behind a loose brick in my father's old basement. I found it the next morning, barely sleeping after the church meeting. Inside were bank statements, property papers, and letters tied together with a faded ribbon. One document made my knees weak. A small house had been purchased in my name when I was 7 years old. I had never heard of it. The bank records showed regular payments made by my father, but the money came from an account I didn't recognize. Then I found a letter from Claire. She wrote that Dad had discovered my uncle was taking money from the family business and hiding it through another account. Dad wanted to report him, but my grandmother begged him not to destroy the family. I felt anger rising in me. They had all watched a lie grow while I lived inside it. Then I noticed one missing page from the file. Someone had torn it out recently. I knew because the paper edges were fresh. I called my uncle and asked if he had been inside the house. He denied it, but his voice changed when I mentioned the missing page. That evening, I returned to the church. The pastor was waiting with an old cassette recorder. "Your father asked me to keep this until you were ready," he said. I pressed play. Dad's voice filled the room, older and tired. He said, "If my son ever hears this, don't tell him I was innocent. I made mistakes too." I stopped breathing. What could my father possibly have done that was worse than keeping a family secret? Then the tape clicked, and he began telling me the part nobody had ever wanted me to know. Dad's voice shook as he explained what happened 20 years earlier. He had confronted my uncle about the missing money, but instead of going to the police, he made a terrible bargain. He gave my uncle time to repay it quietly. Dad believed he could save the family without exposing anyone. Instead, the silence grew. Claire refused to accept the deal, so my uncle convinced my grandparents that she was unstable and dangerous. They believed him. My father stayed quiet because he was afraid that speaking up would split the family apart. Hearing that confession hurt more than I expected. I had spent years thinking Dad was the strongest man I knew. Now I saw a frightened man who had made one cowardly choice and carried it until he died. I asked the pastor why my mother had been involved. He looked away. That answer frightened me. I went home and searched through my mother's old belongings. Hidden inside a sewing basket, I found a second letter. It said, "I know what your father did, and I know what your uncle did. But there is one thing neither of them knows." My hands went numb. The letter explained that my mother had discovered the missing money wasn't the only secret. Someone had been using my name to protect another account. I stared at the words until they blurred. My name had been placed on documents before I was old enough to sign anything. I suddenly wondered whether my childhood had been built around a crime I didn't understand. Then I heard a knock at the door. It was Claire. She was holding the missing page from my father's file. Claire handed me the missing page and told me she had taken it before my uncle could destroy it. The page showed that my name had been used as the legal owner of the hidden account. I felt sick. I was a child when those papers were created, which meant someone had used me without my knowledge. Claire said Dad eventually discovered the scheme and moved the remaining money into the house he secretly bought for me. He wanted to make sure I would have something untouched by the family business. But there was another name on the document. My mother. I confronted her memory with every emotion I had: anger, grief, and confusion. Then Claire told me the truth. Mom had signed the papers under pressure. My uncle had threatened to expose Dad's earlier deal and ruin all of us. Mom believed keeping quiet would protect me. I didn't know whether to forgive her or feel betrayed all over again. That night, my uncle called. He said he wanted to meet alone. I almost refused, but something in his voice sounded defeated. We met in a quiet diner. He finally admitted he had taken the money years ago. But he insisted he wasn't the person who created the hidden account. "Your father did that," he said. I felt my anger return. He slid a folder across the table. Inside was a letter from Dad saying he had created the account to recover what my uncle stole. If that was true, then my father had been hiding more than a family secret. He had been running a private plan for years. I looked at my uncle and asked one question: "Why are you still afraid?" His answer changed everything. My uncle leaned closer and whispered, "Because your mother wasn't protecting you from me. She was protecting you from the truth about your father." I left the diner furious. For the first time, I wondered if Dad had been the real architect behind everything. I returned to the church and demanded the pastor tell me everything. He finally admitted Dad had visited him months before his death. Dad knew he was sick and believed the family would fight over the property after he was gone. So he created the vault as a final safeguard. The pastor handed me one last envelope. Inside was a handwritten note from Dad. It said, "I failed to tell my son the truth while I was alive. I hope he can forgive me for trying to protect him the wrong way." Beneath it was a receipt showing that every dollar taken from the family business had eventually been repaid. My uncle had not repaid it. My father had. I couldn't understand. Then Claire explained the final piece. Dad had sold his own business and used the money to replace what my uncle stole. He did it secretly because he didn't want my grandparents to learn their son had betrayed them. My father sacrificed his reputation and his future to keep the family together. But he had also allowed the lie to continue. I cried that night, not because Dad was innocent, but because I finally understood how complicated his choices had been. Then Claire showed me a final photograph. In it, my mother, father, and Claire were standing together, smiling. On the back Dad had written, "One day, I hope my son can bring us back together." I thought the mystery was over. Then I noticed a date on the photograph. It was taken only 2 weeks before my father's death. That date made no sense. Claire had told me she hadn't seen Dad for years. I asked her why she lied. She looked at me with tears in her eyes and finally confessed. She had secretly reunited with my father shortly before he died. My mother knew too. They had planned to tell me everything after Dad's final medical appointment, but he died before they could. The church vault became their backup plan. I was angry that they had waited, but I was also relieved to learn that Dad hadn't died believing the family would stay broken forever. Claire then gave me something I had never seen before, a recording of my father speaking directly to me. His voice was weak. He said he couldn't ask me to forgive anyone. He could only ask me not to let his mistakes become mine. You don't owe the family your silence, he said. You owe yourself the truth. Those words stayed with me. I realized the real inheritance wasn't the house or the documents. It was the choice to stop repeating the same pattern. I met my mother's old friends and learned how much fear she had carried. I spoke to my uncle again, but this time I didn't excuse him. I told him he had to accept responsibility. He agreed to repay what he could and step away from the family business. Claire finally came home. For the first time in decades, the family sat at one table and talked without pretending. It wasn't perfect. Some wounds were too old to disappear. But the silence was gone. And that was worth more than I expected. A year later, I stood inside my father's old house with Claire beside me. We had decided to keep it as a place where the family could meet honestly. I kept the dusty box, but I no longer saw it as a symbol of betrayal. It reminded me that truth can arrive late and still change a person's life. My uncle followed through on his promise and slowly repaired what he had damaged. I didn't become close to him again, and I don't think. Every relationship has to return to what it was. Forgiveness, I learned, doesn't always mean giving someone the same place in your life. Sometimes it means refusing to let their choices control your future. The strangest part was how my feelings about my father changed. I had spent years remembering him as a quiet, perfect man. Now I remembered him as a human being who was scared, who made mistakes, and who still tried to leave something good behind. I wish he had told me the truth sooner. I wish my mother had trusted me enough to hear it. But I also understand why they were afraid. The night the church bell rang at midnight, I thought I was opening a box filled with my family's darkest secret. Instead, I opened the door to the truth about every person I loved. So let me ask you honestly, if your family hid a painful truth to protect you, would you forgive them, or would the years of silence be too much? Tell me in the comments what you would have done. Share this story with someone who believes every family secret should stay buried, and subscribe to Family Betrayal for more stories where the truth finds its way home. Sometimes the truth doesn't destroy a family, it gives everyone a chance to finally stop pretending.